which we can or don't have to go through, but it was meticulous. But for all that, it was fascinating and exciting, and I loved just about every minute of doing it.
The environment we're talking, obviously, with the ocean is incredibly difficult to see anything, to find anything, and that's going to be a big part, I'm sure, of your research. Is how difficult was it to research USOs? You know, it's one thing to go out with a pair of binoculars or a night vision scope and look up at the sky, look at the stars. You can see something, you can see lights and satellites, but to even go and investigate USOs, you could stand next to the water or you could go on a boat. That's about it, isn't it? So how difficult was it researching the book and what you were finding?
Well, I'm a landlubber. I'll say that. I'm not much of a man of the sea. I've been out on the water many times, but I'm not an expert at it. I would never pretend. So what I did, I was simply hunt for stories and reports as they existed. But I think your question, is a really pertinent one. It's like, how often do we actually record these USOs, these types of sightings? Because you often hear researchers sometimes saying things like, at least half of all UFO cases are connected to bodies of water. I've heard this so many times that I've forgotten how many. And honestly, that's just not true. I have not seen that to be the case in my research. It's a minority. In fact, a small minority of cases. When I go through the vast numbers of UFO or UAP cases that are out there, to find one that actually, where you find a craft engaging in some way with a body of water, is rare. It's rare. It's a minority of them, but it's an important subset, and I feel it did deserve and does deserve to be handled, because one of the reasons that I think there are few of them is simply because we're just, as you say, not out on the water. I strongly suspect that there are many more USO cases out there than what we're getting. For these 3 volumes, I've collected 672 of them. Sounds like a lot, but I read probably through 10,000 or so, I'm guessing, prospective cases until I selected these. So, and even those that I selected, I was looking for USO cases. I wasn't just looking at random. So I was very selective. But I do think that there are probably there's more going on than we're recording. One good way to see that is I created a map of every USO that I put into this book. So I have Google Earth, and I put little yellow pins on the map to track them. And the large number of these occur near the shore, near some nation's coastline. There are definitely cases that I was able to record where they're at the middle of the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean. That's much fewer. And of course, the old joke, guy's under a street light on the ground on his hands and knees looking for something, and a stranger says, "What are you looking for?" "Oh, my car keys, I lost them." "Oh, okay, well, I'll help you. Where do you think you left them?" "Oh, over there where it's dark, but the light's better here."
Yeah.
So, kind of botched that. But anyway, the idea is we're on the shore. We're not out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean most of the time. So, of course, we're not going to see them. You do have navies, the U.S. Navy, Russian Navy, some other navies are out there. The UK Navy has caught some of these out at sea, but they don't like to talk. So it's very difficult to know how much is out there. I believe that there's much more than what I've been able to find. Another reason I think this is, particularly with military cases, a very common way that I would find a military case, because most of those are not through freedom of information. There are a number of the cases I've written about that are fully backed by declassified, usually U.S. government archives, but by some government. But a lot of them are not. But a typical Navy case would be some guy 20, 30, sometimes 40 years after the fact, writing to some online journal or submitting it to the National UFO Reporting Center or someplace like that. And he'll say, yes, back in 1960, whatever, I was aboard this ship and we had this thing happen, and I'm only talking about it now. That is very typical. That's a very, very typical type of a thing, and it's understandable. So I happily include those types of cases. I try to use my best judgment to decide, is this a strong case, is this not a strong case. I actually created an evidence ranking system for these cases, which I discuss at some length in the book. But, I'm trying to, my number one goal for these, honestly, Andy, I was aware that there are all of these events. I don't even like to call them cases sometimes, because they're encounters that happen to a person or to people. In that first volume that you have there, most of those witnesses are not even alive anymore. But they had an extraordinary thing happen to them that not only are these cases forgotten, in many instances, they've never been remembered to begin with. And I thought, this is terrible. This is not right. I know there's a lot of aerial UFO encounters that have been forgotten, just the same. But I thought, well, I could try to do justice to these water-based encounters. That would be a good thing. And I really wanted, more than almost anything else in this book, to just breathe some life into these completely forgotten cases. I think those people who experience them deserve to have their stories told. And these are important events, frankly, if I can say this, in the history of our species and the history of our planet. I mean, when you just stop and think about what I'm trying to describe here. You've got people on a boat, sometimes in an ocean. An object comes out of the water, hovers over their boat, circles around. Their electronics go haywire. Once in a while, they're missing some time at the end. The craft goes away. How is that not an extraordinary, incredible occurrence that needs to be preserved? And so that was really my number one goal, to do that, and to do it in a way that was worthy of the case or the event itself. And fortunately, I had a wonderful illustrator, Alan Levine, who did just a superb job in illustrating many of these cases.
Yeah, there's some beautiful prints that could come out of some of those pictures as well for your wall in the background there. How did you decide on how far back to go? Because I think when you're looking at any UFO, USO, UAP case, there are time periods where you can look and think if it's maybe from the 80s onwards, there's a certain quality of data. You can go back to the 50s and 60s, more paperwork, potentially some grainy video or photographs.
Yes.
After that, it starts to become more testimony based, perhaps some radar data from the kind of World War periods. But
Yep.
then you're going back centuries here where you're truly relying on testimony. And how do you decide I'm going to stop here? Because even the language used at the time, and I wonder, even when I saw you were going back that far, people talking about, and I hesitate to mention things like this, but I will for a reason. Things like mermaids or giant sea monsters. A couple of hundred years ago, people didn't have the terminology for flying saucers, discs, aliens, NHI, UAP. They were just describing something strange in the water. So how did you kind of come to terms of how far back to go?
Great question. I tried to go back as far as the data would allow me. So I looked at, I went back thousands of years and looking for what I thought could be genuine USO cases. I actually did, so the earliest official case that I've included that I have like a case designation for only occurred in 1717, a little more than 300 years ago. And I think that's actually a pretty good case, in fact. But there are earlier potential cases that I do include and I discuss in this book, particularly in the first chapter, which is all dedicated to the idea of ancient USOs. And I really did try to go into it. For example, I did a write-up of the sighting by Christopher Columbus just before he landed in Hispaniola in Santo Domingo, the New World. Because there was Columbus and one member of his crew saw a very unusual light. This is in 1492. And I really try to ask, like, was this a genuine USO or not? And I leave that one open, by the way. I think it's not readily understood conventionally, but it's kind of a vague sighting, and it could be explained by something that they saw on the land. It's hard to know. But I looked at earlier cases. There's a number of 10th century, 11th century Chinese cases I discussed. They are potential USO cases. There are a few even earlier. In fact, Alan did a nice rendition of one that took place in Ireland, allegedly, in the year 597. And I wrote about this. I personally don't think that it's a legitimate USO case. The thing about these earlier potential cases is that when you read them carefully, you find a lot of questions about them. In fact, I discussed one that took place in, I think it was Bristol in 1661, right after the English Civil War. And I had a bit of a conversation about it. And in fact, when you read that case officially, it's like this guy's describing by the River Severn something that similar to the kites that the young boys fly these days, 1661. So you're thinking angular, you're thinking, oh, it's interesting, it's mechanical. But then this object took the shape of a man pacing back and forth, and then it took the shape of a man on horseback galloping back and forth, and then it took the shape of a beautiful woman in a robe of some sort. And to me, this is clearly symbolic, and it very likely had more to do with the end of the English Civil War than any actual sighting. I don't know of what object is going to take the shape of basically Oliver Cromwell, and then King Charles, and then a woman who's probably a personification of peace or grace or something like that. That's how I read it. So these are not cases that I feel that one can work with. I tried to find them, but I try to be careful as well. And so the earliest case that struck me as reliable and that I could trust was not until 1717 off the coast of Martinique by a French ship that was in the Caribbean at the time.
You mentioned a couple of things there about potentially objects, what they could be. When it comes to UFOs, there are the typical misidentifications of it's a bird, it's a misidentified aircraft. Nowadays, Starlink satellites, commercial drones, the list goes on, I think. But as you go back further, or even use the environment of water now, what are some of the key misidentifications you think people would come across in your research over the water?
Well, there's a few things. When I'm looking at any case, whether it's a contemporary one or an old case, of course, in the context of USOs, you're looking for things that are truly unusual or hopefully anomalous. Things that just don't make sense on the face of it, on the face of the testimony and description. So, for example, there is a case, an early one in that book, from 1825, not far from Hawaii, by an English vessel. Really good case. In my opinion, it's a great case because we have the name of the man who recorded it. He was the ship's doctor. His name was Andrew Bloxham. He wrote a detailed journal entry at the time describing what happened on August, I think, 11th of 1825. At 3:30 in the morning, he said, an object described as like a red cannon shot comes out of the water. It's glowing brightly, so bright, he said, you could pick a pin off the deck of the ship at 3:30 a.m. It rises, it's there for a bit, it lowers into the water, and then it does it a second time. Rises and lowers into the water twice. So you're left with this. Now, if it was just one time, perhaps you could envision a naturalistic explanation. I don't even know what that would be. What kind of bright, glowing, orangey orb emerges from the ocean for a number of seconds, lighting up your ship brighter than daylight, essentially, and then you return it. But to do it twice, we're now relying on the testimony of this man. Do we trust him? That is ultimately the question. Do we trust his authenticity, his reliability? I decide, yes, I think that I do. He was the doctor of the ship. He had ship's logs that were quite extensive, and he writes this one particular entry. That's unusual. So I read that, I think, yes, I'm going to include that. And in fact, I consider it a pretty good case. And also, I look for patterns, or I've come to look for patterns. It so happens that there are a fairly large number of USO cases that are marked by glowing orange-like spherical objects that are seen to emerge from the water or hovering very, very low above the water. It's quite a large number of them. It's a significant subset. So what Andrew Bloxham wrote in his journal of 1825 would fit in quite well with sightings that occurred 150 or more years later.
I was going to ask you just on that, good timing. So you mentioned those orbs within the book. Are there any types of objects or craft that seem to be more exclusive to water than we would find over land or on land? Is there any recurring themes?
That's a fantastic question. No, what I found are the shapes and the types of objects described could be described as any ordinary, any UFO or UAP. So you get a few different types. Gray, silver, metallic, disc-like objects, flying saucers, were common as USOs. Cigar-shaped objects, which you often get as classic UFOs. These also are USOs, many of them. Orbs or spheres, very common. Particularly when they glow, they're almost all inevitably an orangish type of color. Not always, but predominantly so. Sometimes white, sometimes a few other colors, but orange is quite common. There are a small number of triangular USOs, just as really even with aerial sightings,